I'm really honored to have Nan Keohane here today with us, or in Hawaiian, as we like to say, Nan Keohana,
Right.
which does mean sugar cane in Hawaiian. I looked that up today. It's pretty good. But Nan has this extraordinary career in academia as both an intellect and as a leader. And when we developed the list of who we were going to invite, I definitely said, I get to interview Nan if we get her to come. So I'm really honored to have her here. I first met Nan in 2013, or I met her. She didn't really meet me in that case because she was giving the memorial address to Catherine Davis, who passed away at 106 and was so important to Wellesley. And it was a great address, and that's where I first interacted with Nan. And she was a Marshall Scholar, and so she got a degree from Wellesley and also Oxford, and then a PhD from Yale, and then had a distinguished career in academia, first at Swarthmore, then at Penn, and then at Stanford on the faculty there. And that's where I wanted to start the questioning, if that's okay. We decided we're going to talk about the presidency, college presidency. I'm obviously quite interested in that, and the state of the liberal arts and where it is, where it's going, why it's useful, why it's valuable, and then a little bit about the future of higher ed. And we'll leave at least 20 minutes for questions. We really want to make this a conversation with the audience. But I want to bring you back to when you were at Stanford, and you got a call, as I seem to remember, or you got the call, or there was some interest in you as coming back to Wellesley as the president. And talk a little bit about what that decision was like. You were on this academic track, and then all of a sudden you move into the presidency of Wellesley. What was going on? How did that transpire?
Well, I'll be glad to talk about that. But first, I want to say how delighted I am to be here. It's good to be back at the College of the Atlantic. I was here a few years ago for a particular ceremony for Francis Perkins. And I met a few of you then, and it's wonderful to see Duke people and a couple of Wellesley people, and to be in the Davis Center. As Darron said, Catherine Davis was a wonderfully dedicated Wellesley alum, as well as a supporter of COA. So we share that in the whole Davis family. So I was a very happy, newly tenured associate professor at Stanford, having enjoyed writing a big book on 17th century French political thought, and expecting that I would be a happily employed professor at Stanford for the rest of my life. It was a great job, after all. My family loved it. My husband was chair of the political science department. My kids loved being in school there. But then the call did come, and it was in an odd way. I had had no preparation for being a college president, zip. I'd never even been department chair, much less dean, provost. But somebody thought maybe I could be a college president, even so. So I got a call, would I be interviewed for the presidency of my alma mater? And it was a time when people were saying, we can't have a real search, at least one woman on the list, a sort of token woman on the list, to say we considered a woman for this job. So I was one of the people who was sometimes asked to be a token woman. I said, no, thanks, no interest. But when it was my alma mater, I thought, at least I should talk to them, because I would like to tell them that I think Wellesley is missing a big chance to be a serious leader for women's education at a time when so many other people are going to co-ed. I have spent most of my life in co-ed institutions. I think they're great. But I think there's also a place for strong women's education and girls' schools. And that was especially true, I think, in the 1970s, which is what we're talking about, when the whole world was turning over. Wellesley knew how to educate women, but we weren't doing it in a dramatic, strong, committed, we're with it way. It was sort of not co-ed by default. So I wanted to meet with them and tell them I thought they should get more pizzazz and move with it. And I thought they would say, oh, thank you very much. We'll have a good life. But they didn't. They said, the alumni interview committee said, we actually agree with you. so we'd like to have you meet with the board. So once I'd said that, I could hardly say, no, I didn't really mean it. So before I knew it, we were having to make a family decision because I was offered the job. And it was a big move. In the long run, I'm sure we'll talk a lot more about what it means to be a college president, but I'll conclude that part by saying I sat at my desk in July 1981, exactly the same desk where the distinguished president of Wellesley when I was a student, Margaret Clapp, had sat a couple of times when I went into her office as a student government person. And there I was, and I sat there and I said, I don't have any idea what a college president actually does. But people came in with letters to sign and appointment cards and people to meet and buildings to look at. And before I knew it, I was on my way. Not your usual thing.
So we have other things in common then as being presidents of our alma mater. And I too was hired with zero experience in the college presidency.
I didn't realize that.
Yeah, no. I did not come through the traditional track. Is you're a faculty, then you're a department chair, and then a dean, and then provost and president. So same thing. I was in the same spot. But one of the questions that I'm always asked, and I want to ask you is, okay, so you assume the president of your alma mater. There are faculty members there who were your mentors when you were a student. I have one sitting in the back row right now. I can't quite see him. And we all know that faculty don't have bosses, but all of a sudden you're the president and nominally the boss. What did that happen? And what was that interaction like?
You're quite right, because it had been only 20 years since I graduated.
Yeah.
So there were quite a few faculty members around. And some of them thought, this is strange. But other people thought, well, at least we know we have a colleague who cares about the college and knows what it's like. And let's give her a chance. And they did. So that didn't turn out to be a problem.
Good. Yeah. So obviously, one of the biggest roles of the presidency is in philanthropy and doing philanthropy. And I don't know about you, but I'm often also questioned like, oh, don't you hate asking people for money? Like when you went to Duke, you were, successful both at Wellesley, but at Duke, you were at the driver's seat of a $2.36 billion campaign.
That sounded much bigger at the time than it does now. It was big.
Sounds pretty big to me right now. Like I'll have to, but like.
All right, sounds big now too.
If you could slide a few $100 million of that our way, that would be great. But talk to us about why you do like philanthropy and what it means and how you thought about that process.
Well, I'm glad to do that too, because of course, when I went into the job at Wellesley, I had no experience in that as well as anything else. So I had no idea what it would be like. And I had a sort of neutral view of it. I didn't think it was negative, but I didn't see it would be positive either. It's just sort of something you have to do. But I had a wonderful mentor, the vice president for development at Wellesley at that point, knew that I would need to have a really positive experience with my first big fundraising venture so that I would really feel good about it. So he decided that the thing for me to do was to fly out to California with a wonderful trustee colleague to request a naming gift for a new field house at Wellesley, which is the last thing I expected to raise money for. But Wellesley had an old gym, which still smelled exactly the way it did when I'd been there 20 years ago. It looked the same, it smelled the same. It was the same. Smith, Mount Holyoke, everybody were building these brand new, wonderful gym field houses. So it was clear we needed one. And this particular alum had been one of the few professional athletes in her generation. She was a golfer. And so it seemed a natural. And on the way out, I decided that I would make a particular kind of plea. So we sat down in her living room, and she was an experienced giver. And she said, I'm sure you've come to ask me for money. And I have thought about what I would like to do. I would like to give a bird bath in front of the museum. And I thought, okay, what do I do now? So I said, well, that could be a very pleasant gift, but let me tell you what I have in mind. And then I went into my spiel, and I made my main argument that her husband, who had recently died, to whom she was devoted, had given a field house in his name at Williams. And I said, wouldn't it be wonderful to have his and her field houses in New England? And she said, sounds good to me. And she gave me exactly what I asked. And when I got home, my husband, who's sitting back there somewhere, right there, Bob, who's here with us, sort of asked me what it was like. And I said, you know, I should have asked her for more. And then I knew it was going to be all right. You're not taking someone's last penny. You're talking with a potential colleague, a partner, to do something important. And you want to give them the sense of commitment to that, because you know, as philanthropists, they'll give somewhere. And you want them to think about Wellesley or Duke or the College of the Atlantic as the place. And so when I got to Duke, that's one thing I had a lot of experience in, and that made a big campaign much easier.
Yeah. While we're on the subject, I have to ask you to reflect a little bit on Catherine, because Catherine was such a wonderful woman. This woman crossed the Urals in the 1940s on horseback, just this real adventurous spirit. And when one of my first experiences when I got here was, okay, we need to go meet Mrs. Davis, like bring your family. And I had 2 little girls at the time. And I said, if there is ever a time to behave, girls, now this is the time. And she was, of course, so wonderful and easy and charming. Just tell us about Catherine and who she was and how you got to know her as a woman and as a philanthropist.
Well, of course, for us as well. I mean, the very first summer, we came up to Northeast to spend the night at Catherine and Shelby's house. It was so wonderful. It was foggy when we came in, and I was in a lovely guest bedroom. And when I woke up in the morning and looked out over Somes Sound, I thought, this is surely one of those beautiful places in the world, as you all know. So I got to know Catherine quite early, and I admired and liked her very much. We became good friends, and she was very supportive of the college. One anecdote that I would tell, because some of you knew her, or at least knew of her, she did die quite far in her years, and we had dinner at the Islesford Dock restaurant when she was 104. And she came out in her wheelchair and had to be wheeled up the ramp. And it was, of course, dead low tide.
Right.
She was wheeled up the ramp into the restaurant, and I sat near her. We had to bend down to talk to each other because she was hard of hearing, but she was still extremely alert in every way. And because she'd had such a wonderful career, not only riding over the Urals, but getting a PhD in 1935 in Geneva in international relations, when young women like her from New York didn't do that, she did it. And she was a very scholarly and thoughtful person, and she was a great speaker. Bob has always said, you know, Catherine Davis is the person I don't want men to follow on the podium. And that's exactly the way I felt. So when she and I were having that dinner conversation, I leaned over and I said to her, you know, Catherine, you've had a wonderful career. But if things had worked out differently, you have a PhD, you're a great speaker, you're a scholar, you could have been a fine professor at a place like Wellesley. And she said, it's never too late. Now, of course, at some level, she knew that was ridiculous, but at another level, she meant it. That's the way she lived her life.
Yeah, that's a great story. Great story. So one more question on the presidency before we go to the liberal arts. It's hard being a president. I mean, you're kind of at a lightning rod for controversy, and then today it's, you know, either sexual harassment or, you know, it's just oftentimes you're really at especially, you know, students, you know, you're for me the man, right? When students don't like or are challenging authority oftentimes, as they should be, you know, and as a young person. So just tell me a little bit about like one of your most challenging situations where something unfolded either at Wellesley or at Duke, that you became in the hot seat, and how do you manage all the constituencies that do tend to kind of touch the presidency?
I think your point about the multiple constituencies is very much on target. You mentioned the students, the faculty, the board, the alumni, the townspeople, the parents of students, the numbers of constituencies, each of whom has a genuine concern and a genuine reason to be interested and needs to be attended to, but whose concerns may be somewhat different. I hadn't heard the analogy of a lightning rod, but I think that's a very good one. People often talk about mayor of a small town or whatever, but I think lightning rod as a college president is a fair way to put it. And both you and I could easily tell of very, very happy and very rewarding moments, but you asked me about challenges, so I'll answer in that vein. And there were several at each place, and I will tell in more detail about only one. At Duke, for example, when we got there, there was a question as to whether we were going to create the former women's college as a freshman campus so that the freshmen would get there and have their own place to live and work, etc. It was a very controversial decision. Everybody expected me to make it. Of course, I said, look, I just got here. I don't know Duke well. I need to know the place better before I make that decision. So I waited a year, and then after a year, I decided that we should, with the board, of course, it wasn't only me, decided we would indeed create a freshman East campus. It was very controversial. Some of the seniors said, you're ruining the place. They told people not to come, etc. And then there were others, same-sex marriages in the chapel, whatever, the sweatshops. In each, there's a story. But the toughest of all was at Wellesley, and it was South African divestment. And I'm sure everybody who was a college president at that time felt it in one way or another. And at Wellesley, a large number of the students were very much in favor of complete divestment. The board had decided that we would support, some of you may remember, the Sullivan principles, which were you only invest in companies that do some good in South Africa. They support the schools, they employ Blacks, whatever. So the argument was they're actually making a difference for good. So we shouldn't divest from them. We should divest from all the others, including any who are working with the government of South Africa. That seemed a good answer, but the students didn't think so, and some of the faculty didn't think so. So there was a there was a faculty meeting, a teach-in, a healthy one, right before a trustee meeting, when I became convinced that full divestment was the right answer. But I hadn't had time to prepare the board for that. The next morning I said, look, this is not a vote of confidence in me at all. This is a vote of your conscience, whether you believe that we should still stay with the Sullivan principles or whether, as I now believe, complete divestment is the right answer. We had a good discussion and the vote came out 17-16 in favor of the Sullivan principles. So I had to go out on the front steps of the library with the chair of the board. All the student activists were waiting in front for the news. And when they heard that we were going to stick with the Sullivan principles, they all scattered by prearrangement. The Wellesley College campus is a little like COA. There aren't too many ways to drive into it. At Wellesley, there are only two. So they blocked both entrances. That meant that nobody could get out on a Friday afternoon to pick up their kids at daycare, whatever. Everybody was getting fairly frantic. And so I'll make a long story short. We had to decide what to do with the students lying in the road. I learned that you cannot arrest someone. I mean, you can't get somebody to move or pick them up or whatever unless you arrest them. So we had to arrest the students. They got over to the side of the road. And then I learned that if they give their names, they can be let go and come back to court next week. They wouldn't give their names. They said they were Winnie Mandela. They all said Winnie Mandela. So that meant we had to take them to jail. If I had known any of this in advance, maybe I would have been better prepared. But all of these things were the sorts of things you don't learn about in this job until you're in the middle of it. And so there was only 3 places in the Wellesley town jail. And the only alternative was the Framingham Women's Maximum Security Prison. And I had volunteered there as a student playing basketball. And I thought, having to tell parents that their daughters are in the maximum security prison is the last place they want to be. Then there was this great blessing. The chief of police was a member of the National Guard, and he called and asked if the National Guard Armory could be commissioned as a prison, and it was. So they stayed there overnight. We brought them hamburgers and cots. And in the morning, they felt they'd made their point. They gave their names and left. But it's the sort, I mean, it's the sort of thing nobody could have prepared you for, right? But you make each decision as wisely as you can, and you live with the consequences.
Wow. Great story. It reminds me a little bit of the divestment from fossil fuels that a lot that here is obviously really critical, and
yes,
but interesting analogy there. So, you were president of a liberal arts institution at Wellesley, and then of one of the most important, growing at the time, research institutions. And I know you and I, when we talked before, and I know of your just how important the liberal arts are to you as an individual. Explain what liberal arts means to you, and why are they liberal, and are they only arts? Why do they even call them the liberal arts, and why are they crucial from your perspective?
Well, you should answer this.
No,
too.
I don't want to answer.
All right, I was just thinking, I was just wandering around this building a bit before we began, and I saw, the next room with all kinds of skeletons of various things, obviously fine science going on here, and I knew that. And marvelous agricultural, I know the sorts of work you all do, but it also is, it's at the core, a liberal arts education, because that doesn't just mean the arts or even the humanities. It means the sciences, the humanities, the social sciences, knowing our world from history through the most magnificent explorations of modern science. What it is not is an immediate technical education that gives you a professional credit for after you graduate. It is instead a way of giving you a grounding, a foundation in knowledge. I think of the liberal arts, which are historically given that name, artes liberales, from the Middle Ages, as being designed to stimulate and help satisfy your native curiosity as a student, and give you the means to continue to learn and to find answers to your questions long after you graduate, instead of just giving you a fixed body of knowledge to do a job with, which in today's world is pretty soon going to become obsolete anyway. We do need technical knowledge, but other ways we can get that: professional school, job training, whatever. But the liberal arts gives you a mental storehouse, not a storehouse, a mental way of learning that is very strong. Cherry Murray at Harvard, the dean of engineering for a while, had an image I like of a person as having a T-shaped education with a broad top and a very deep stem, which is your major or the discipline that you choose. And the discipline is important because it allows you to learn something thoroughly instead of just everything in bits and pieces. So a T-shaped education, which is giving you the means to satisfy your curiosity and find answers to your questions all your life. Just one more image, and this one from a Wellesley president, Alice Freeman Palmer, who was asked, because at that time it was very unusual for many girls to go to college. Well, why should we go to college? She said, we go to college to know, assured that knowing is sweet and powerful, that it satisfies the mind, that it enlarges the mind, and makes us citizens of the world. And I would argue citizens not only of the world, which is really important in this global age, but also citizens of our community, of our city, of our nation, so that we are prepared for adulthood in a very deep and powerful way. I know COA does that, Wellesley, Duke, many of the fine institutions we've all been through. And I think it's a powerful education.
It is, and that I'm glad we're recording this because I can use some of those lines in my future work. But I was a first generation college student, and we have a lot of students who come to COA as first gen students. And I will say to the parent of a first generation college student, they're sending their student off to college for the first time. Like, let's be honest, they they see college as the way out, right? Or the way up,
The way up.
the way up, right? And when I had to convince my dad that I wanted to be a wolf biologist, like in his mind, that's not a job, like that is not a career path. Like, so I've often found that like there's a demand to say, okay, liberal arts, I get it, but explain to me how this is going to get my young son or daughter or
Right.
whomever a job. And so there is that, of course you want to be trained how to know, but you also want the students to be able to, move through life. Okay, how do you wrestle with that?
Well, I think you recognize that many employers now in Fortune 500 companies or wherever, well, often have had liberal arts educations themselves, not always, but many times, and will tell you that they want to find employees who are able to learn, who are flexible, who are able to move. I do understand, however, the concerns that particularly of first-gen college, but of many college students, presidents. And I think we have to be realistic. One of the reasons for a major is that it gives you the grounding to move forward in some field.
Mhm.
And to remind your parents that a wolf biologist is a real job, that a teacher of English is a real job. It may not pay a lot of money, but it's a real job and you're being prepared for it. And it may help to improve the world in some ways. But we have to recognize that thinking of your major with a future job in view is not a wrong thing at all.
Yeah.
But it's different from coming to college only to prepare yourself to work.
Yeah.
You come for that, but you come for many other things.
Good. Yeah. You taught when you were president, both at Wellesley and Duke, or?
Well, I taught at Wells. I had been teaching at Stanford, as
Yeah.
you said, and I hated giving up teaching. So I taught a seminar around the fireside of the president's house at Wellesley for a few years. It was great for the students. It was fun for me. But I knew enough about teaching to know that I was giving them aging background knowledge. I wasn't keeping up with my field at all. And after 3 or 4 years, I decided that was not doing them a favor, and it was not the best use of my time. So regretfully, I gave it up for the last half of my time at Wellesley, and I didn't try it at Duke until my last year, when I wanted to learn to teach again because we were going to go to Princeton and I was going to be teaching there. I wanted to get back into groove. So I co-taught with a good friend, a course in inequality for upper level students at Duke. And that, I mean, it was a wonderful seminar. We had a great time. But having a co-teacher was crucial because he knew me very well. And on those days when we had some major crisis of administration right before I walked into the classroom and I was looking a little dazed, he could tell. And even if it was my turn to start the day, that seminar, he picked it up and he began it so that I could take a deep breath and get into teaching mode. So that I enjoyed very much. In some ways, I wished I'd done it more often. But it's hard because you really are shifting gears. It really is different to think about the challenges of managing an institution that we discussed and teaching a class. They're very different enterprises.
Yeah.
And trying to shift in about 5 minutes is not easy.
Yeah. I'm teaching in the fall. That's
Good
my-
luck.
Yeah.
But it's rewarding
Yeah.
for you and for the students.
Yeah. Our boat captain is going to be my co-teacher in a way, so I can
That's
lean
good.
on him a little
That's
bit.
good.
But I asked the question because imagine your teacher thinking about liberal arts education and what you said about teaching, and let's imagine you're not president, but you're back at Wellesley and you have an incoming class of first-year students, and you have to assign them a book over the summer, okay? And then this is going to be that kind of that first-year seminar book. What would strike you as a really good summer read to help those students prepare for the transition from thinking like a high school student to thinking like a liberal arts student as an undergraduate?
Well, that's by far the toughest question you've asked me. How can I name one book?
Doesn't have to be the only book,
No,
but say
no.
like one book
One
to
book.
start.
Okay,
Right, yeah.
one book. Well, I'll give you this one partly because my current project is writing a book about Virginia Woolf and modern feminism for many reasons, which I won't go into here, but that's what I'm working on. And with that in mind, a book that I would recommend for anybody to read as they're thinking about shifting gears to college would be her essay, A Room of One's Own.
Why?
Because it gives a basis for talking about the ways in which men and women have, at her time, had very different entry points into the world. Some exclusion. Women couldn't go to university, for example, when she was writing this book. And then they could because she was speaking to the young women at a university. But when she was coming through, almost nobody went to university. It was very rare. And it also talks about women and men in a variety of settings. It's in the end very positive and optimistic about the relationship between the sexes. But it's also somewhat playfully, but also somewhat cuttingly, sharply observant along the way of some of the tensions between men and women.
Yeah.
And I think both men and women should read it and think about it.
Good, thank you. So when I started here as president, it was 2011. And in 2011, the big acronym of the day was MOOC, right? Massive Open Online Courses. And there was this, I describe it as a paranoia that, oh my God, the world of the kind of residential undergraduate program was about to disappear. Now, granted, a lot of small schools have closed doors since then, and a lot will continue to close doors, I think. But what were you thinking when you started to hear about these massive open online courses? And what utility might they have, or what concerns did you have about them?
Well, that takes us, as I'm sure you're doing deliberately, to our final topic of the future of higher education. When people first began to offer massive, whatever, online courses open, it seemed like a really thought-provoking and intriguing opportunity. But it reminded us that people had tried technology as a substitute for in-person learning for a long time, through television, through radio, through television, whatever. And somehow it never quite was the same. This maybe was going to be the same. The goal was to teach, dozens, hundreds, thousands of people around the world. But that seems an odd way to learn if you also want to have any discussions, any conversation, even any interchange with your professor. So I was not entirely sure exactly what the utility was going to be, other than making information available to people who might otherwise not have an opportunity to learn, which seems like a good thing. But MOOCs never really took off. And there are many reasons why that's true. I was at Harvard on the corporation when one of the most successful courses, Michael Sandel's course on justice, which is a very popular course at Harvard and was a successful MOOC because he did it with, television screens and people talking to each other literally from around the world. He was very skilled, but it's very difficult to do well. And I think for me, the subsequent development of online learning, which was made crucial by the pandemic. Nobody wanted to have the online learning be our only way of doing it for a year and a half, but it was. And people learned how to teach much better online and to do a better job of having it be interactive. And I asked the deputy vice provost at Stanford a few days ago about what do you think this will be down the line? And he said he believes that hybrid learning will be the most familiar technique, but it won't be hybrid so much with any one course as hybrid with different types of courses and different stages in your life. He said, for example, it's a great idea for students who, for example, first-gen students or students who are coming from very small high school to have an opportunity for some online learning the summer before they come, to help them develop skills that they will need to study. And then it's very valuable for online learning to be available for alumni down the line who can't necessarily travel from across the country to come back to COA for 3 weeks or 6 weeks or 3 months, but can take an online course. And many of you have taken online courses after graduation when you're getting back to ideas that intrigue you. So he sees it as online learning as something that will be interwoven through our classrooms, but also before and after you graduate. Mm. And I think that's very promising, more promising than the steady one huge MOOC.
Yeah. Yeah, you're absolutely right, where the pandemic really tested our ability, and people don't come to the College of the Atlantic to take online courses. They come specifically for that close interaction, same as Wellesley. Right. And I think we've learned the strengths and weaknesses of that mode of delivery, and the weaknesses definitely outweigh the strengths. One of the other things, and I'll make this the last question before we move to questions from you all, is this demographic decline. The second worry is that, if you count out 18 years past 2008, the financial crisis, and look at the demographics of the United States generally, especially New England, there are just going to be many fewer college-age students who can pay for college. Many, many more first-generation students, many more Hispanic students, many more Black students. And the worry was this is going to cause a kind of this demographic cliff for many institutions. And for places like Wellesley that have an endowment of a large enough, magnitude that they don't rely so much on tuition. But we've seen how that demographic change has already begun to affect so many small liberal arts colleges. Do you think, what do you think, looking 5-10 years into the future, will the role of small liberal arts colleges outside of the elite institutions play a smaller and smaller role in educating the country as a whole? What do you think?
Well, I think you've touched on a really significant problem for our future. I would answer that in several ways. First of all, setting the small liberal arts colleges aside for a moment. For many institutions, there are opportunities to think about educating people who are not 18 to 22 mm-hmm. and doing that well, whether it's students who come for a summer program from high school, whether it's people who take professional school activities, if you have them, executive education. I mean, people are learning at different stages now. Mm-hmm. And a university may be able to weather this challenge more easily mm-hmm. because you can more easily educate people from across the age range. There are also undergraduates who are not 18 to 22. There are not a whole lot of them. But even if it weren't for the demographic decline, I think you put your finger on the major challenge that we face, the incredible cost of higher education. And it is a real cost. It's not just a sort of frills, mm-hmm. but it's getting increasingly difficult for many families to afford it. And we have to realize that, not only to try to keep costs down and collaborate to share the burden, but also to make financial aid one of our very highest priorities, mm-hmm. no matter where and who we are. And so when going back to your point about philanthropy, the easiest pitch for me ever to make was financial aid, mm-hmm. making it possible for someone who can't afford it to come and have the Wellesley or Duke or COA experience. Seems to me just a slam dunk reason why people would want to help. And if we can make that more prominent in people's philanthropic thinking and build our financial aid kitties, that will help. I also think we need to look to our relationship with our communities. We need public support too. And public support, even for state universities, has been declining, mm-hmm. so that people are caught in a vise here. More students, less support. And we have to repair the breaches between our colleges and universities and the people in our towns and cities. Help them to see why higher education is so important. We have to do that partly by looking to some of the flaws, the moats in our own eye. I think some PC excesses, for example, on some campuses have gotten to be a real barrier to communication across beliefs. And we have to address that. We have to be willing to talk about it. But we also have to be able to make the case for higher education to people in our towns and cities directly and why it matters so that we have more public support.
I could talk forever here, right? But to you, but I promised Nan that I'd cut it with 20 minutes because we really want to get your thoughts. And Wes has a microphone back there, and if you would like to ask a question, could you raise your hand and use the mic so our folks that are joining us remotely can also hear? Questions? Tom?
Thank you. It was a wonderful talk today. I really enjoyed it very much. How do the universities justify the explosion of costs that families are being asked to absorb? It's staggering to me. I remember what I paid in the 1960s and 70s for a college education in New York City. And it's just out of reach for most people.
I think that's a really crucial question. And I can tell you that both as a college president and as a corporation member at Harvard, every year when we have the discussion about raising tuition, I would ask that question. I would say, look, we cannot just keep raising tuition forever, but somehow it keeps going. So then if you probe into it, first of all, there are ways in which we could contain costs, but it's tough. We are labor-intensive organizations. The salaries are such a huge portion of our budget. And unless we're going to keep the salaries of the wages of the people who work for us without raises, that gives you a steady reason in itself. If you give them a cost of living wage or a merit raise or whatever, the budget is inevitably going to go up. And it's a huge proportion of what we pay. The cost of buildings are expensive to maintain, to keep in order. And I mean, how much joy this new building has given you. But having new buildings, which is a great advantage, is also expensive. But keeping up the old ones is even in some ways more expensive. So our costs are so fixed, people and buildings, and it's very difficult to do more. Productivity is hard. As people often say, productivity for a string quartet is a very difficult concept. And I think in some ways it's true for a college. You've got many different parts that need to come together. And unless they're all there, you're not giving a true education. So I believe strongly that we have to recognize that there are some reasons for the pressures on costs. But I also believe that we ought to be much more assiduous about thinking about ways. And for me, it's collaboration to keep it down. So one of my highest priorities at Duke was collaboration with UNC, which seemed to some people like heresy, right? I mean, the Blue Devils and the Tar Heels are supposed to be collaborating, but we did. And in many ways, which I won't go into, we were lucky enough to be 12 miles apart, two very fine institutions. So teaching certain courses, sharing library work, whatever we could do. Even there, we ran into difficulties. One example, we were going to have a single department of Swahili. Seems like we ought to be able to do that. The problem is that one of us wanted to teach Swahili for people who are now going to go work in Africa. One of us wanted to teach Swahili as an elderly language. It's not the same thing. So that, I mean, we overcame it, but it's not easy.
As a tag onto your answer from Tom's question about financial support for higher education, can you tell us what you know about our government in terms of making changes to make it more affordable for United States citizens to go to college? Because in many institutions, it seems as though we're educating foreign students whose rich families can support their children to come to our country at the detriment of educating American students. So something has to give. And we're doing things differently than many other foreign countries who are educating their students. Granted, it's a smaller proportion of their students than here, but I'd be interested to know what our country might be doing nationally to help the situation.
Well, it's a complicated question. Part of the problem is the demographic decline that Darron mentioned. So if there are fewer American students coming to the colleges, then one other source to supplement them rather than to replace them. And certainly we shouldn't have a situation where American students are being kept out of the colleges. But as long as they can get in, to have some of the rich foreigners come in and help pay the bills and also enrich the education of the American students by giving them an example of a student from a very different part of the world. As long as they're not replacing, it seems to me is a plus. And particularly in some of our graduate schools, we don't have enough American students applying for science and engineering. If more American students applied, they would get in, but we're bringing students from China and Sweden to fill our labs and make the TAs work. So I think part of the problem is that American students aren't necessarily showing ambition to go into certain fields. I think that is changing. I think it will continue to change. And the last thing I would say is we've been talking about liberal arts colleges, but if the government is to provide support, and I think it should, I think support for community colleges is a very good step along the way, because community colleges that are giving real, partly liberal arts educations are doing a real service, and a number of their students may transfer to a place like COA or Duke. So I know you're pointing to a difficult problem about balance, but I don't think the issue is that American students are being kept out to let rich students come in. It's more a complicated mix than that, and it needs attention. But I think foreign families might say right now that the problem is they're having trouble getting visas even to get in. So it's really a complex question that you raise. Certainly government policy is central to it.
My question is about the future of the liberal arts specifically. And when I came to COA 30 years ago, one of the things that really attracted me was the real interdisciplinary nature of the faculty and how many people were teaching very happily with other people who were very different from themselves. And we are confronting a higher education system where there is very little reward given to young faculty for doing that. And so what I've seen over time is narrower and narrower applicants for jobs. They're very, very bright within a very small discipline. And we can't get faculty to teach in our core course quite a lot of the time. I've just been asked to serve on a tenure committee for a liberal arts university out of state. And the candidate is a very bright scientist, but I see no trace of what I would call liberal arts in their resume. They're really good at studying a really small part of our overall knowledge. So my question is, where will you get the next generation of liberal arts professors if we have a system where being multidisciplinary is not going to be rewarded?
Well, I think you put your finger on a significant problem. And universities have differed in their ways of tackling it. This is one place where I think Duke has done a particularly good job. And I won't go into the details of how, but Duke had seen that problem coming, has a very strong interdisciplinary thread, and at least in some departments, rewards professors for teaching broadly based courses. That's not necessarily true of every school. I think the real nut of the problem here is that the disciplines that these students are coming from don't reward multidisciplinary activity. They tend to reward, if you think of my T image, they tend to reward the part that goes down, where you're very deeply delving into your discipline and making original contributions that may be very important to a few hundred people, but are not going to be the basis for strong, broadly based teaching. And having a system where we have to persuade the departments in a tenure committee to give a plus for having taught a broadly based course Some colleges do it and some do not, but where their departments are tone deaf about it, it's really hard. So I think you've put your finger on a major problem, but I don't think it's often the college administrations themselves who are the problem. And you didn't say that. It's often the disciplines themselves who just say, well, you taught that course, but why should you get tenure on the basis of teaching a course that was half history instead of science?
Hi, Nan. I'm Kate. Nice to meet you. So I have a question for you, but I also wanted to share. I work at Bard College, specifically with the Bard Prison Initiative.
Right.
And I'm so grateful that I grew up here on the island, and that my time coming back to state overlapped with this conversation, because these questions are so urgent and we're really doing a lot that we can as another small liberal arts college, specifically through the Prison Initiative. The return of Pell funding for incarcerated students has meant a whole new edge to this precipice and crisis around online learning and what that means for different types of students, depending on where you're getting educated. But also, we, for the last 3 or 4 years, have been working in partnership with organizations like the Brooklyn Public Library and nonprofit organizations to provide tuition-free college opportunity within communities. So we're actually leaving that traditional campus environment, and now, inside the pandemic, started a tuition-free BA program at Bard's main campus for those non-traditional students that you were mentioning, students who are not 18 to 22. So we're in the mix with COA and what your vision for what is next in terms of thinking about how not just this incoming freshman year, but 18 years out, what does higher education look like? And it's really exciting. But so I actually have a more personal question for you. I'm really touched by your story of coming into a position of leadership where you felt like you had, both of you, not the experience of being a college president and coming in, but also struck by a very long career in leadership and being able to shape and take your vision and apply it in these different environments. And I'm sort of in an earlier phase of my career, stepping into positions of leadership, and wondering if you could just talk a little bit about how it might have been kind of scary to say, hey, I need to wait a minute. You're being pushed for your leadership, pushed for direction, and saying, how did you have that true north of, I'm going to take a minute, listen to myself, find my direction? Where did that come from for you? And how did it sort of pan out over all these decades? I would love to hear a little bit about that.
That's a lovely question. I wanted to preface my answer by saying I'm so glad you mentioned Bard, which is truly an exemplary institution for the sorts of things interdisciplinary and reaching out we've been talking about. Such a creative place. But I'm also glad you mentioned the teaching people in prison, because that's an example of the ways in which education can reach out. I hadn't named it, but it's a good example. And I think it's a particularly appealing one. One of my granddaughters who took a gap year before starting Yale because she didn't want to have Yale all online her freshman year and is now going back next month, spent the year working with programs for incarcerated people, particularly a writing opportunity. They do an annual edition of a journal of writing from people in prison, essays, poetry, fiction, you name it. And Frances was one of the editors of the volume this year. And the opportunity for her to talk to people in prison for whom writing was such an important release and focus, and the education that leads to it. But in terms of your own question, I think you're right to say you don't want to be pushed into leadership. But it wasn't, I had the feeling I didn't even want to be an administrator, which is very different from saying, this is something I want to do someday, but I want to get ready for it, which is probably a healthier way to approach it because you're likely to be better prepared. You can find ways to lead and to manage in smaller settings without being pushed into lots of committees or a deputy deanship before you're ready. But I think you also need to recognize that, particularly for women, it was certainly true for me, I don't know if it's true for you, we tend to be less self-confident about ourselves, and we tend to underestimate our abilities to go in and do something. I think, for example, of all the students who I talked to who were applying for a Rhodes or a Marshall, I know what, women would say, I'm going for it. I think I have a really good chance. And some guys would say, I don't think I'm really ready. I don't think I'm really good enough. And that's a different mentality.
Mm.
So recognize your abilities, be willing to go with them, but don't let yourself be pushed too quickly into being slotted in a particular way. I think your instinct about that is right.
I think we could do one more question.
I'm interested in your opinion of cooperative education, like they have at Northeastern University. Do you believe that it offers a nice combination of academics, but at the same time of learning an actual skill? And can it also not help financially in that you can make some money every other semester?
Well, I think it's a very interesting model. I don't know a lot about how it actually works, so I don't want to try to give an answer in depth, but certainly the principle of learning and earning and making a skill, as long as the learning part includes enough of the depth that we've been talking about, the liberal arts depth. So it's not just an adjunct to your project that's a co-op's earning skill. That would seem to me a good pattern to pursue. I don't know enough about it. I know Northwestern is going great guns, Northeastern, sorry, is going great guns these days. Northwestern too, I suppose,
Probably.
but Northeastern for sure. But I don't know enough about how cooperative education works, but you're right to put it on the list. And you remind me I should know more about it. Thank you for mentioning it.
Beth, did you have one? We can.
So thank you. I think lots of us in this room are great advocates of liberal arts education, and we see the changing demographics ahead. And I'm just wondering, what's your advice to small liberal arts institutions for showing the changing world of applicants out there the value of the kind of education that we offer? I think it's complicated, and if you have any advice about that.
I think it's very complicated. Maybe one of the most persuasive things is to get testimonials from alums who've gone on to do very interesting and successful things. Highlight them in your publications to show that these are the sorts of things you can do with a Wellesley or a COA or Duke institution. May help, rather than just talking in principle about the value of it, the way I've been doing. Have people show this is really why it mattered to me in my job, 20 years out. One of the things that I find most rewarding is a student who will write 20 years out and said, that course really mattered to me. I remember when you said X, and I found it useful in my job just yesterday. And I go, okay, that works. And if you can have testimonials, I think that helps. If you can also reach students early enough to have them start thinking about it so that they get the preparation, they take the right courses in high school, they fix their minds on saying, okay, someday I can do this, rather than having somebody hit them with it senior year and say, hey, where are you going to college? I think those are two things you can do. And the last thing you do, I think, is to think together, as we're doing here, about how we address these problems. We don't all have to do it individually. We can have discussions like this. We can learn from each other. We can have people go on admissions tours together to talk about their institutions. You get more people in a room. So I think there are ways to do it, but you're right, it's a challenge.
Man, thank you so much. It's an hour. That was amazing. Yeah.
Thank you. I've enjoyed this very much. And I wish that I could stay and mingle and see quite a few of you, some of whom I know, but we have our family visiting. And in order to make our day's plan possible, we need to get back to Southwest Harbor for a ferry before too long. So Bob and I are going to have to take off pretty soon, but I wish very much I could stay and hear more of your questions in person and meet more of you. And I'm just honored that you came, and you're part of a fine institution. If you're part of COA, you live in a lovely place if you live in this whole area, and we're delighted to be here. And I'm honored to have been asked to speak. Thank you.
Thank you, Nan.